While 1970's The Dunwich Horror is probably the first somewhat famous adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story, it was not the first adaptation of a Lovecraft work. In 1928, The Call of Cthulhu,
It's a total fabrication.
In the 1960s, there were adaptations made of 3 of Lovecraft's stories, albeit all under different titles, as well as of The Shuttered Room, an August Derleth story inspired by notes that Lovecraft left behind. I actually owned 2 of these films on DVD years prior to deciding to make this list, but both of them were corrupted and could not be ripped. It's as though the Elder Gods themselves didn't want me to make this list, but I did it anyway because I'm Dr. Briggs, and this is Talk Horror. We can thank Roger Corman for first bringing the words Necronomicon and Cthulhu to the big screen in 1963's The Haunted Palace, which gets its title from an Edgar Allan Poe poem that draws very loose parallels to the story on the screen, which is primarily an adaptation of Lovecraft's single full-length novel, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. In it, Vincent Price is Charles Dexter Ward, and has inherited a palace in Arkham, Massachusetts from his twice-great-grandfather, a warlock named Joseph Curwen. After studying his portrait, Ward comes to be possessed by his ancestor, picking up his experiments as well as seeking revenge on the descendants of the townsfolk who killed him. Fans of the novel probably notice that this is not quite the same story that the book tells. In The Haunted Palace, Ward's possession is orchestrated by members of Curwen's cabal, 2 ghoulishly complexioned men named Hutchison and Orne, who respectively lure him to Curwen's palace and bring him eye to eye with the warlock's spirit. Lon Chaney Jr.'s Simon Orne is one of the roles where he comes off the most genuinely sinister, and Milton Parsons, who played in The Twilight Zone as the Wax Henry Landru, also has a memorable presence as Hutchison.
What are you doing to her? Honoring her, Dr. Williams.
When Ward becomes possessed by Curwen, Price slays the double role, and the fact that he is possessed so abruptly and remains possessed for a majority of the film lends it something of a bleak feeling, despite the departure from the original twist. Having watched The Haunted Palace first without having read the story, I found it to be a pretty decent, subdued possession film. However, this changes the entire nature of the horror that you find in Lovecraft's novel. In the case of Charles Dexter Ward, Hutchison and Orne are not Curwen's co-conspirators, only confidants. Really, mostly evil pen pals throughout much of the narrative, whose letters to one another progressively unveil the plot that's afoot to the narrator, Ward's family doctor, Dr. Willett. It is Ward's own obsession with his mysterious, purportedly wicked ancestor that allows Curwen alone to manipulate him from beyond the grave. Not only does this allow more suspense to be milked from the concept, it turns Ward into more of a character. More than him just being a traveler getting duped by something he doesn't understand. And it makes Curwen more detestable, knowing that it was all his plan to prey upon his descendants' innocent curiosity. The movie cuts away a lot of what makes Curwen a sick figure. One thing it's important to note is that the essence of Curwen's experiments is completely changed in the film.
I fear beyond your understanding. As a matter of fact, we don't fully understand ourselves.
Actually, Cthulhu is never mentioned on the page, and while Yog Sothoth's name is invoked, his experiments are in necromancy. His mutants are not the offspring of outer gods, but beings he conjured from improper ingredients, and the ultimate aim of these resurrections is disturbingly mundane. The only person Curwen resurrects in The Haunted Palace is his willing companion Hester Tillinghast, Ward's twice-great-grandmother who was repelled by Curwen in the book's backstory. None of this is to say Curwen's goals in the film aren't fucked up, and I mean definitely fucked up for a wide release from 1963.
Next, women will start wandering out late at night, eyes all glassy, bellies filled with God knows what, then you'll see.
But it's a little much when you put it up against the single-minded cruelty of the novel's villain. The film also winds back the time frame of the story by over 50 years, from Lovecraft's own lifetime of 1928 to 1875. Whether this was because it'd be more familiar to its audiences expecting a Poe film, or probably less cost-consuming for AIP, What it accomplishes is lending historical credence to the film's townsfolk eventually forming an angry mob. The Haunted Palace devotes a good chunk of time to locals Whedon and Smith's vendetta on Kerwin and the horrors that Kerwin's cohorts have inflicted upon them. Their role was confined almost entirely to flashbacks in the novel, while the film has this whole subplot about history repeating itself, which we get in place of Lovecraft's choice to focus on Dr. Willett's investigation into the reason for Charles Dexter Ward's mental state. In the film, Dr. Willett is a generic, sympathetic local who had an ancestor take place in Joseph Kerwin's execution, but has seemed to completely escape his or his comrades' notice until he begins assisting Mrs. Ward, which really shows the cracks in this twist on the story. Oh, and Mrs. Ward is an invention of the film. The only Mrs. Ward in the novel is Charles's mother. The cinematography has some effort put into it. The music is on the better end of your typical 60s drive-in horror score, and there's little to complain about the performances. The pacing, on the other hand, is a little off-putting. We get like 4 shots of people going down this whole staircase from the same angle, but we rush through our big death scenes in rapid succession with little build-up. In being such a loose adaptation of the case of Charles Dexter Ward's actual plot, Haunted Palace misses the essence of what made the story such a fascinating, suspenseful one. It has plenty of Lovecraft-themed window dressing for sure, but a foundation of a gothic ghost story that's just kind of typical. 1965's Die Monster Die was the second Lovecraft adaptation to be distributed by AIP, based on Lovecraft's story The Color Out of Space. Despite the changed title, this is the only official adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story of the decade. Rather than kind of inspired by a Lovecraft story, an adaptation of a Lovecraft-inspired story, or a Lovecraft-based story but supposed to be an adaptation of an Edgar Allan Poe poem. It's fitting that its director, Daniel Haller, would go on to direct the Dunwich Horror in 1970. Die Monster Die follows a scientist who travels to the estate owned by his fiancée's family, who live right by a stretch of land left desolate and sterile in the wake of a meteor landing. The landowner, Nahum Whitley, played by Boris Karloff, denies that he has inherited any of his father's madness, but keeps items from his bizarre rituals in a hidden stone cellar, and more than that, locked away in his greenhouse. His wife stays hidden behind a curtain hanging from her bed, and has been slowly wasting away from the same malediction that has affected the land and the servants. She has invited the protagonist to the property in hopes of protecting her daughter. Rather than acting as a first-person narrator being told second-hand about the strange changes taking place upon Nahum's land, Die Monster Die places the hero right in the midst of the tale, and introduces an unnecessary love interest into it. Nick Adams plays Stephen Reinhardt as more of a pulp hero rather than a neutral observer, and his fiancée Susan Whitley, a character invented for the film, may be the happy-go-luckiest character in any Lovecraft adaptation I know of, which is unfitting considering what's happening to her mom and dad and how it's being played pretty serious. I believe this is the first movie to feature a Boris Karloff character moving with the help of a wheelchair, something that would be incorporated into most of Karloff's later films as the actor's arthritis became debilitating. His commitment to his craft in the face of real-life pain lends the role a good deal of pathos, but Nahum's actual lines don't leave him much to work with in terms of elevating the role.
Why did you bring it into the house?
I thought I'd found a way to turn this wasteland into a place of beauty. That was my dream. I thought the name of Whitley would mean something once again.
The character never seems as pitiful as Nahum at the end of Lovecraft's story, and less so given that he devoted himself to rituals surrounding the blight on his land, and remains largely unconcerned with his family's suffering for much of the runtime. While Die Monster Die changes the specifics of its story to an even greater degree than The Haunted Palace did, the original takes place on a farmhouse, Nahum is a farmer with no interest in the occult, and by the time the protagonist enters the story it's too late to save anyone. Nevertheless, it remains truer to the spirit of the original story. Numerous critics since The Color Out of Space was first published have remarked on the meteor's corruption being similar to exposure to radiation. Die Monster Die makes this explicit, but rather than using this as an excuse to turn it into a mutant animal attack film or something, the adaptation uses body horror just like Lovecraft did. They even use Lovecraft's visual of crumbling for how things afflicted by the meteor eventually break down. While we get mutated flora and fauna, their scenes are brief, and with one exception, only serve to unnerve the audience with their distorted appearances and otherworldly cries. The ending, while significantly different from The Color Out of Space, still incorporates the titular color's luminance within the final threat of the film. The cinematography in the film delivers several atypical shots that feel ahead of their time. In fact, there's a lot of it that feels memorably modern. The effects are pretty damn icky by 1965 standards. The pacing in the action scenes is up-tempo and frenetic, while the soundtrack comes alive with both eerily bizarre sound effects and shots where natural ambiance takes over the soundtrack, without dialogue, music, or stock background cues to remind you it's just a movie. Die Monster Die may still be a loose adaptation, but it is a film with an identity and many merits of its own. Rewatching it was a pleasant surprise, and more than one scene left me thinking that this one could have been a childhood influence on Sam Raimi. 1967's The Shuttered Room, produced by Warner Brothers rather than AIP, is the one film to take its name from the story it's based off of. But The Shuttered Room is not a story penned by H.P. Lovecraft, but by his bibliography's conservator August Derleth, based on notes that Lovecraft left behind. I'm ashamed to say I'm not aware of how much or what of Lovecraft's notes Derleth used as the basis for The Shuttered Room, only that it quite randomly mashes together the family from the Dunwich horror, which actually was named Whately, with the titular town from The Shadow over Innsmouth. And the writing style is pretty clearly a pulpier imitation of Lovecraft rather than the genuine article. Still, I'm including this one and the next on the list for completeness sake. Rather than following a lone male offshoot of the Whateleys being brought by his late father's will to destroy his ancestral property and anything living within it, the film adaptation follows a female descendant, Susanna Kelton, who is summoned simply to inspect the property as part of her inheritance, and she brings her husband along with her. Her husband Mike is something of a pulp hero himself, and more than once finds himself in physical altercations with Ethan, played by Oliver Reed in a role invented for the film, another relative who feels entitled to the property that's been left to Susanna. Not only do we get a romantic subplot in this one, it's a huge part of the movie, and it basically replaces the investigative angle that ties the Shuttered Room's inhabitant to the marshes of Innsmouth, i.e. the main thing that makes Derleth's story identifiably Lovecraft-based. There is a notable age gap between our two leads, and less of one between Susanna and Ethan, which makes the drama between the men seem more volatile. It also makes lines like this feel even colder and more uncomfortable.
You're not your highly intelligent young woman. At least that's the impression I had. Of course, if I find I'm wrong, I'll throw you in the nearest ditch without a backward look.
Though I personally give the writer the benefit of the doubt and speculate that it's supposed to be uncomfortable, given that the subject matter of the story is largely about shunned and abandoned family. And I do give the film points because the bones of the story are very much intact. The cinematography is probably the most refined out of any of the films on the list, and the soundtrack by Basil Kirchen, who created the music for AIP's Dr. Phibes movies, is definitely the most distinctive one among them, which is good and bad. Not only that, the film gives us the list's best ensemble of performances. Instead of just one or two actors carrying the picture, everyone puts in a believable effort. This bird was out to get an Oscar for this part. It's a very watchable sort of slow burn that I have one major gripe with, although it's a big one. For how good the build-up in The Shuttered Room is, there's hardly any payoff at all. We spend a lot of time on Mike and Ethan's feud, and when it finally spills back into the main plot, we are promptly rushed into the film's conclusion. While this conclusion is fairly faithful to the original story, I chalk my disappointment up to the lack of certain details from Derleth's backstory that, when omitted, make the inhabitant of the room's fate feel very undeserved. Now, while I don't doubt that 1968's The Curse of the Crimson Altar actually was based on H.P. Lovecraft's The Dreams in the Witch House, I am 98% certain that I would never have made the connection on my own. It never comes up in the credits, and the story is completely different. It does, however, bear striking similarities to the previous 3 adaptations on this list. Instead of a scholar who becomes enamored with a long-missing witch's arcane knowledge after sleeping in her house and meeting her within a vast and mind-boggling dreamscape, we have yet another pulpy stock protagonist, an antique dealer searching for his missing brother. He follows his trail to the town of Greymarsh, where he finds his obligatory love interest and travels to her uncle's stately home. This being an upgrade from the meager lodge that Dreams in the Witch House takes place in. Just like the AIP films both upgraded their stories' humbler settings to estates. Just like in Die Monster Die, we meet a wheelchair-using Boris Karloff, and he lets us know that rather than vanishing mysteriously into one of the arcane angles that she drew, the witch of the film version was burned at the stake and cursed the town. Exactly like what happened to Kerwin in the beginning of The Haunted Palace. There are no scares taken from the story's descent into forbidden knowledge, unless you account for what is said during the Scooby-Doo tier twist in the end, and the dream world portrayed in the film consists of one room, probably to help facilitate that twist. In other words, it is nothing like H.P. Lovecraft's The Dreams in the Witch House. Perhaps the most telling clue to The Curse of the Crimson Altar being a Lovecraft adaptation is that the witch in the film, played by Barbara Steele, is named Lavinia, just like the albino Whately daughter from the Dunwich horror. However, like the witch Keziah from Dreams in the Witch House, she does appear in people's dreams to try and get people to sacrifice others and sign her book. She's just way less scary looking, doesn't have a hideous human-faced rat as a familiar, but leads a cult of vaguely disgruntled people in animal headgear instead, and the only angles we see her coming out of are in this kaleidoscope filter when somebody is dreaming. What's even less fortunate is that Curse of the Crimson Altar doesn't even get that much mileage out of Lavinia's curse, or explain much about her powers or goals, despite being bloated with dialogue. Like a dime store precursor to The Wicker Man, most of the film is hyper-fixated on missing brother Peter's disappearance. Since he's the first one seen in Lavinia's dream world bending to her will, one can guess that he's supposed to be pretty similar to Gilman, the scholar from Lovecraft's story. But we get so little of Peter's actual character that it's hard to be concerned about him, or about his two-dimensional brother's struggle to not fall into the same trap. There's not enough suspense in this film to kill the sloth victim from Seven. The mystery plot is lethargic. Clues are revealed at a slow pace, most contain nothing of substance, and Michael Gough is the only actor in this one who doesn't seem completely bored. Christopher Lee, bored. Barbara Steele, bored. Boris Karloff, boredest Karloff. In the 1930s, the editor of Weird Tales offered H.P. Lovecraft to have The Dreams in the Witch House adapted to radio. Lovecraft turned down the offer, stating of radio plays, they are all the same. Flat, hackneyed, synthetic, essentially atmosphereless jumbles of conventional shrieks and mutterings. It's scarily prescient how accurately this describes the Curse of the Crimson Altar, except it's stuffed full with mutterings and I can't find a single shriek in it. That said, Lovecraft probably would have used the same words to describe the other 3 films on this list as well. In some way or another, each one fails to truly utilize the sense of impending doom that Lovecraft injected into most of his works, instead appearing to use superficial aspects of his stories to try and give a fresh spin to already worn horror tropes like mutations, cults, and the living dead. Something Lovecraft adaptations continue to be guilty of, as Charles Dexter Ward, Color Out of Space, and Dreams in the Witch House would all get closer readaptations in the future, which nonetheless still resort to forcing in all kinds of Hollywood melodrama at the cost of their story's unwavering focus on dread. But if it's a sign of a good horror author that even a superficial adaptation of their work can produce an effective genre flick, then H.P. Lovecraft stands among King and Barker as one of the champions. The atypical aspects of Lovecraft's style tend to somewhat bleed through, and lend even the lower effort adaptations a distinctive flavor. The 4 films on this list stand as an early testament to that. While all are imperfect adaptations that in some ways give into the most tiresome tropes of their era, at least 3 out of 4 of them have much to recommend giving them another look in the modern day. I'm Dr. Briggs, and until our next journey into the unknown and the forgotten, I bid you to look horror, listen horror, talk horror.